NSW. Prison guards of Reddit. What's the most disturbing thing you've dealt with? Psych patient, after placed in an observation cell, pulls a razor out of his anus and proceeds to go to town on his genitals. Inmate in segregation would regularly eat his own crap. Multiple bad fights and suicide attempts. Contractor fell 30 feet. Ankle was completely 90 degrees to his leg. Refused an ambulance or medical assistance for fear of being drug tested. Had 2 guys working with him help him walk the half mile to the front gate. Worst by far was a seg inmate slipping his cuffs, removing an officer's bean slot bar. Big chunk of iron with a prong on the end we used to open slots in the cell doors to pass trays through handcuff inmates, and beat him to death with it. Was one of the first responders. I quit shortly after this one. Former prison guard. I had to escort a new prisoner to medical. I had no idea why until we got to medical. He had bandages all over both legs and he walked stiff-legged, couldn't bend his legs. When he sat down, the nurse started removing bandages to expose rotted, abscessed flesh. He was a rage addict and was injecting in his legs. His legs were so swollen and gangrenous that the smell almost put me down. When he tried to bend his right leg, the skin split and infection oozed all over the floor. The doctor looked at me and immediately called for another guard to come to the room. I asked what was wrong and she said, "You're going into shock. I need you to leave before you pass out." Surprised at what she said, I protested, but she demanded that I leave. On my way out, I started to feel lightheaded. I looked in a mirror and noticed that I was sheet white, normally a brown guy. I've seen people hanging. I've seen people stabbed and shot. I saw the guy blow his head off with a shotgun. When I was in the Corps, I've pulled burned bodies out of a crashed CH-53E. This, by far, was the worst thing I've ever seen. I knew a prison guard at Winson Green in Birmingham and he said the most disturbing thing about Fred West was how jovial he was. The officers kept forgetting and laughing at his jokes and stuff and then thinking, this guy tortured his own daughter and buried her in concrete. I was a co at a max unit for several years. I'll just make a list. I had a guy slice his own neck in front of me. Had a guy hang himself on a night we were very short. I had to stand there and wait several minutes for another person before entering the cell. We were able to save him. Had a guy hang himself and succeed. Had a guy collapse in front of me and die. He had a brain aneurysm. Had a guy try to connect his tattoo gun to the light. He electrocuted himself. He died. I've caught people having intercourse twice. Once was willingly and the other was for protection. I've been on the 3rd row and the power went out. It was pitch black for about 20 seconds. Power loss was always the scariest thing to me. Had a guy who had come in with a relatively minor sentence, now serving over 100 years consecutively due to crimes he committed while incarcerated. He would attack any co he had a chance to. He was notorious for popping his door open and attacking cops. Had different guys try to attack the nurses on a few occasions. If you ever go to prison, don't do this. They're the ones who decide if you need to go to a hospital or go back to your cell and drink water. Had to fight a psych patient in the back of an ambulance on a transport. Had to sit through multiple surgeries because someone has to have eyes on the inmate at all times. Once I had to wrestle with an inmate when he was coming out of his anesthesia. He was out of it and freaked out. A buddy of mine is a guard at a women's prison. He wants us to confiscate a Jolly Rancher dong. These crafty women collected Jolly Ranchers and molded a rainbow colored shaft, then wrapped it in saran wrap from the kitchen and passed it around. My friend's mom was a prison guard when I was younger. We went there with our whole class, and she told us about how inmates would break down mentally. One story I remember her telling multiple times. She was on night shift and was suddenly alerted by screams of help. The screams came from a cell, and her being careful she looked inside the door window. There, in the farthest corner, an inmate was on a chair, screaming, pleading for help, and trying to avoid something on the ground. "Mom, what's wrong, inmate?" "Inmate, it's the chickens. Please get them out," while still standing on the chair, jumping and crying. "Mom, what chickens? Where are they?" "Inmate, everywhere. Please get them out." So friend's mom opened the cell door and guided the invisible chickens out. The inmate calmed down, but as friend's mom closed the cell door, he screamed, "You forgot one." So she went back in and got the remaining chicken. Note, the inmate in this story was a big ass biker dude. He was probably on drugs, but I think it's a fun story. One of my old roommates worked in the county jail. He came home one day with a stone face, so I asked him how work was. All he said was, I saw a guy eat his shampoo because he couldn't shower, then uncontrollably puke and crap himself. That's how my day went. Jail, not for me. My dad never told me about this, let alone about him working at the prison. Mom told me about the reason why he quit, however. Dad was getting everyone back to their cells, and when passing by one of the cells that had already been checked and filled, his face was splashed by a boiling liquid. He had to be rushed to the hospital for his burns. Turns out the prison gave each cell a hot plate of some sort, and a prisoner had boiled his pee and threw it at my dad's face. After that, he got out of being a prison guard and began doing blue collar work. From when my dad was a guard, 2 prisoners trying to kill a 3rd prisoner. The shank broke, so they put a pen in his ear and stomped on it. It came out his mouth and he lived. What the frick? My dad used to work as a CO, and he would never tell me any stories about his time there until one day of constant badgering he told me the tale of the Easter surprise. Easter morning, one of the inmates thought it would be a brilliant idea to get completely naked and shove a toilet scrubber all the way up his ass so the only part visible was his bristled bunny tail. He then proceeded to scream that he was the Easter bunny while trying to hop around and avoid the oncoming guards. I work closely with all the prisons in the state. There's one notorious inmate who likes to jerk off and throw his semen in everyone's face. Fellow inmates, guards, it doesn't matter. He's not strict to semen. Sometimes pee and crap. Just whatever he can get his hands on. My dad was installing a ventilation system at a women's prison. He had a nice chat and a sandwich with an inmate. After they said goodbye to each other, a guard told my dad that the woman was sentenced for life because she killed her husband and put the body through a meat grinder. I had a neighbor who was a CO at a juvenile prison in my city. There was a new kid at the prison one day. He was apparently very shy and very quiet. He had the misfortune of sharing a cell with one of the more violent inmates. His second night there, his cellmate unscrewed a screw from a bench and sat on his bed in the middle of the night. When he woke up, he said, "I'ma make you a pirate," and shoved the screw into the new kid's eye. My neighbor was the first CO to respond to the kid's calls for help. When asked why he shoved a screw in the new kid's eye, he claimed that he looked at him the wrong way. That's a pretty fricked up situation if you ask me, and not one I'd like to deal with under any circumstances. Not a correctional officer, but I did work as a PA for 8 months in a state prison. I saw an inmate shove 2-3 feet of an electrical cord up his urethra in an attempt to cath himself. I saw an inmate rip out a catheter and he was bleeding profusely from the urethra. His cell looked like a pig was butchered in it. Inmates would often make homemade dermal implants in their dong. They would cut the skin, slip something in the wound like an eraser or piece of metal, and try to get it to heal without getting infected. This was to give move pleasure to the ladies when they were out. Of course, men who were in there for decades or longer. Oh boy, here we go. My first fight I responded to was a stabbing. Trying to contain that situation with nothing more than OC spray and gloves was a pretty grim welcoming to corrections. I try not to look at their charges because I find it hard to treat them the same after I find out that they are a violent sex offender. Almost every time an inmate is polite and seems like a decent enough person, I end up hearing their case in the news and it is 9/10 sex charges. I saw the guy who slipped in the bathroom have his hip come completely out of his socket and his leg came out at a ridiculous angle. Trying to have a conversation with someone and de-escalate them when you can hardly see them because so much feces has been spread over the window. During a strip search, an inmate used his hands to make his butt cheeks say, "Excuse me sir, but do you have a breath mint?" But by far the most disturbing thing is the complete lack of accountability. 90% of these guys have convinced themselves that they are the victims and have done no wrong. Never accountable for anything and have a sense of entitlement that is more frustrating than anything to deal with than any other aspect of my job. Becoming accustomed to being threatened is a pretty strange phenomenon. I didn't realize I had become desensitized to it until I was threatened by an inmate telling me, "I am going to murder you and assault your wife." I told my family that it happened a few weeks later just as a "oh by the way" sort of thing and they were mortified. Whereas I had almost forgotten it happened. An inmate who was infamous for packing drugs in his rectum came in and completed his dry cell stint in segregation. Other inmates didn't believe him when he told them he didn't have any drugs on him this time, so they decided to check for themselves. They accomplished this with a Dasani water bottle enema. The host of medical conditions you see during strip searches is alarming at first. The list contains testicles the size of mangoes, genital warts larger than their dong, AIDS lesions always make me gag, and of course dong amputations always catch you off guard. Not really disturbing in a traditional sense, but still made me uncomfortable. I'm a CO at the Denver complex for the Department of Corrections. Seeing James Holmes, the Aurora Theater shooter, come through our processing after getting sentenced. I'd seen this man's face and heard the stories for 2 years on TV, but seeing him in person just slapped me in the face with a weird sense of reality. I don't really know what I expected, but it was pretty disturbing to me personally. My dad is retired from the Federal Bureau of Prisons and started out in the California prison system. There are a lot of stories that us kids didn't find out until he was retired. He was attacked with a pipe and almost died. He doesn't know who attacked him or why. He was on a kill list from the Mexican mafia, and my mom got threatening phone calls from people saying they were watching us kids at the bus stop. He transported inmates back to Cuba, where they were promptly walked around a corner and were shot and killed after they were handed over. I'm pretty sure he shot and killed fleeing inmates, but he won't confirm it. He has walked in on many suicides and saved a few people trying to commit suicide. He won't talk about a lot of things, like riots. He was head of the SWAT team, so he has seen some crap. I've tried to get him to write these stories down, but he won't do it because he doesn't want anyone to get in trouble. Worked for a state prison in Louisiana for 5 years. A few highlights. Inmate ripped his own colostomy bag out in the shower, which resulted in his death. Inmate attempted suicide by cutting his own jugular vein. Lived because of the officer's training. Inmate attempted to cut his own dong off because he no longer wanted to be a male. Changed his mind halfway through after pain became too much. Inmate heated coffee and baby oil in cup for several minutes, then threw in dorm officer's face. I will never forget the screams of the officer, who unfortunately lost his eye. Inmate was so much he could not longer control his bowel movements. Not me, but a friend of mine is a correctional officer at a jail, and I asked him this question after 6 months of him working there. He said there was an old Asian man that barely spoke any English that bashed his head on the wall until he started bleeding and demanded to be airlifted to a hospital in Atlanta. His injury wasn't that bad, so they were able to treat him in the jail and tossed him in the padded room so he could not hurt himself anymore. I guess he wasn't satisfied, so he took out his dentures and scraped at the wound he got from hitting his head on the wall until there was a 3-inch area of skull exposed. Needless to say, he got what he wanted and was airlifted out of there. Honey buns are routinely spent on intercourse as a currency. Also, the amount of ramen noodles a normal college student eats in a week would make you rich as frick on the block. My friend was in prison in Northern Ontario, and I was surprised by his honey bun stories. I think you could trade 5 for some weed, and if you wanted someone beat up, it would cost you 20 honey buns. I guess without cigarettes, they needed to develop some kind of currency. I have 2. One CO friend at a city lockup knew an inmate who everyone called the gingerbread man. He would get naked and cover himself head to toe in poop. He was trying to get insanity, but his crimes were drug dealing related. He was beaten rather badly a number of times by the 3 or 5 guys he shared a cell with. He stopped eventually, then went to real prison. Another CO I know knew a guy who was kept solo because he kept trying to give people his HIV, filling plastic pen tubes with blood. He would try to stab people and then blow into the tube. He died one night when my CO friend wasn't there, when he broke a light in the infirmary instead, slashing himself up and threatening to give anyone who came in HIV. They locked the door and told him to wash up under the shower. He wouldn't, and he bled out hours later. Some COs get reprimands and demerits or whatever, but nobody lost a job because the investigator could understand not wanting to be given HIV from a bleeding psycho armed with long shards of broken glass. I'm a carer at a max prison. I've seen an inmate lick his own crap off his walls. I've seen an inmate cut up where his cell floor was covered in blood. They will dilute it in water to make it look like there is more blood than there is. The inmate lived. And I've seen an inmate hog tie his cellie and put a plastic bag on his head and then put his property box on top of his head. Inmate survived. Guys I've worked with have seen worse, like an inmate ripping open his guts, an inmate pulling chicken bones out of his urethra, and of course inmates who have successfully hung themselves or got beat to death by their cellie. Not a prison officer, but my dad spent 26 years working as one in the UK, Brixton then Belmarsh. Heard a lot of crazy stories, including how the IRA prisoners used to be. Mess strikes used to happen frequently. They used to cover themselves in their own feces, wait for the guards to go into the cell and attack them. They then just started hosing them down through the service flap. He also told me swallowing razor blades was fairly common amongst prisoners, although one time this guy didn't think that would be enough. So he slotted a bunch of razor blades amongst the bristles of a toilet brush and then rammed the whole thing down his throat up to the handle. He lived. An inmate in segregation got very upset that he didn't get some paper a co promised to get him on first shift. Sucker ripped off his own big toenail and cut up his arm with it. Not me, but a friend who worked in a state prison down south for a few years. On his first day of the job, a very tall, very intimidating inmate stood over him and said, "I could kill you right now if I wanted to. Glad I don't work in a prison. I'd poop my pants." Went on a field trip to a correctional facility and one of the guards told us about how there was this one prisoner who would constantly cover himself in his own feces. He didn't stop there, as he would hang himself still covered in crap. When inmates hang themselves, guards obviously have to try to save them. The way they do it is one guard lifts up the inmate to relieve the pressure as the other one cuts the rope. So the guard who held him up would be covered in crap. Yay, he did this often as well. When I used to work in the jail, I initially thought people covering themselves in their cells in feces was as bad as it ever got. Then one of the inmates in my partner's cell block had a miscarriage into the toilet and smeared the afterbirth all over the cell door. Suddenly, a Picasso doesn't seem all that bad. I don't work corrections, but I still respond to local jails to complete assessments for inmates on suicide watch. Arrived just in time for sheriffs to locate a dead inmate with one eyeball popped out of his head. After watching security footage, they discovered another inmate was choking him while they were fricking, and the guy killed him on accident. Fricked his eyeball out. You have been visited by the lemon shibby, like in 3 seconds, or you will never have vitamin C again. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day, you magnificent people.